very soon. Here we go. All right. Well, welcome everybody. I can see folks streaming into our virtual room. So glad to have you all here this evening. My name is Sam. I work for Third Place Books in Seattle. Some of you may recognize me from times of old and events in our stores. You may also recognize me from events here on the internet. And some of you may recognize me from about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, when we were trying to host this event the first time. Thank you so much for joining us for this rescheduled event. We are so glad to have been able to get Gail Tsukiyama and Karen Joy Fowler back, and we are so thrilled to have both of them here tonight. I have just a couple of announcements to make before we get started. We are here tonight to celebrate books, and in particular, the brand new novel from Gail Tsukiyama. It is The Color of Air. Some of you may already have ordered your copies of The Color of Air from Third Place Books. If you have not, I'm going to go ahead and post the link to that book, to order that book, in the chat tonight. The chat is it'll be on the right-hand side of your screen as you're looking at it. You can click on that link and purchase a copy of The Color of Air, and we will ship that book anywhere in the country for you. We can also have that book available for you to pick up at one of our 3 neighborhood Seattle locations if you are here locally. All 3 of our stores, Lake Forest Park, Ravenna, and Seward Park, are now open for browsing. So you can come on in, take a look at what's new, and pick up your book as well. And we thank you for your business and for your support. It is a hard, weird time to launch a book right now. Your book purchase at these events is what allows writers like Gail Tsukiyama to keep writing, and Karen Joy Fowler. It allows them to keep doing events like this. And it is also, of course, what sustains and supports and invigorates your indie bookstores, which put on these events and help produce them. So we thank you for your business and your support in these strange times. We are so glad to be your bookstore from wherever you are joining us from tonight. If you have questions tonight for Gail, you can post them in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So this will be at the bottom of your screen, kind of in the center. It just says Q&A. You click on that, you can type in a question, and we'll see those questions come up and we can ask them at the end of the event. And again, we thank you for your participation and your questions. We'll get to as many as we can tonight. Now, without further ado, I am thrilled to welcome, finally at long last, a couple of authors that I've been very excited to host and was looking forward to all last week. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Gail Tsukiyama and Karen Joy Fowler, 2 favorites of many of you out there watching. Gail Tsukiyama was born in San Francisco to a Chinese mother from Hong Kong and a Japanese father from Hawaii. Those roots have permeated much of her fiction. She attended San Francisco State University, where she earned a bachelor's degree and then a master's in English. She's a best-selling author of 7 previous novels. Many of you are no strangers to them. They include Women of the Silk and The Samurai's Garden. She has received the Academy of American Poets Award, the Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award, and many others. And her new novel, which we're here to talk about tonight, is The Color of Air. Here joining Gail Tsukiyama is Karen Joy Fowler. She is the author of 6 previous novels, including the Booker Prize finalist We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, and the Jane Austen Book Club, which spent 13 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Her novel Sister Noon was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction, and her collection Black Glass won the World Fantasy Award. She lives in Santa Cruz, California, where she's joining us from tonight. Please, and as you can see the beautiful background, I'm quite jealous. Please join me in welcoming Gail Tsukiyama and Karen Joy Fowler.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam.
It's an enormous pleasure and privilege for me to be able to be here tonight and talk to Gail about this wonderful book. And one of the things I just want to say at the outset is that Gail and I have known each other for a very long time. We are not just friends, we are very, very close friends. And there is a particular pleasure that you can get when you are lucky enough to have friends who are also amazing writers. in which you have sort of watched a book come into the world. You have witnessed the agonies of creation over the years that it took to write it. And so, you know, to bring that all together into the final book, and to be able to read the book that you, in some ways, have gotten to know just through conversation is a particular thrill. And in my opinion, it is motivation enough to be a writer, is that you get to hang out with other writers and watch them work through their books. So this is, I felt, you know, both quintessentially Gail Tsukiyama and also a departure in some ways in terms of location and emphasis. And I thought I would just ease us into the conversation by asking you to talk about the title.
She says ease us into the conversation after she starts with this grandiose introduction of our friendship.
This is a wonderful book. I back off on not one word of it.
I'm going to just kind of jump on what she has said, and I do agree. We're in a profession in which we spend so much time by ourselves, angsting over, are we doing something right? Are we writing, is this the right word? Is this the right sentence? Are we conveying what the character feels? And to have a friend like Karen, and we're actually very lucky because we have a group of friends that get together once a year. And during that once a year, I think we hear all of our angst, don't we, Karen?
Yes,
about
we
what
do.
we're working
Save
on.
it up all year.
And we're helping one another just by being able to talk about it, by being able to say, I can't do this. And the other person saying, yes, you can. You've done it before. You can do it again, kind of thing. And what's hard is when you have these friends that are so talented, like Karen Joy Fowler, you always want to try to be a better writer. And I think that's what is so important about these writing kind of friendships. It's not that we have any kind of antagonism with one another. It's actually worked opposite. And I think it's really a gift because I know it doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen, right, Karen? Where you uplift the person as opposed to trying to knock them down, which I think that happens a lot in the quote unquote art world in general. Not only being a writer, but because we spend so much time by ourselves trying to figure out if we're doing this right, it is so important to have these other people who have our back. So thank you, and thank you for being here, and thank you for your words. But it all has brought us here this evening, anyway. So I'm really happy that I'm here with Karen. It's like being with my sister. What was your question?
The title.
The title. Okay.
Did you have it from the very beginning?
Well, actually, Sam didn't say this, but what I did, when I entered university, I wanted to be a film major. I wanted to make films. And that didn't work out because films were way too technical. And if you were here 2 weeks ago, you know that technical stuff is not my forte. So thank you for being here this 2 weeks later. What had happened was I then transferred over to the writing department. And in the writing department, I took this course called Writers for Writing. And it was when a writer came to speak to the class. And the first person who came to speak was a woman poet. Her name was Kathleen Fraser. And I immediately fell in love with language. I just loved that you could do so much with a word or a line. And you could say, you could give history in a line. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to be able to tell a story in a small space. And I know you're thinking, well, what does that have to do with the title? It has everything to do with the title because it goes back to my whole idea of poetry and language and what words mean. And I knew when I was writing a book about Hawaii, per se, I didn't want it to have a title that was like, I don't know, the 5 volcanoes or, you know, the mango tree, or even the pineapple field, sugarcane something, or whatever. And I had used at the epigraph, I have it right here, the very color of air in the place I was born was different. The smell of the earth was special, redolent with the memories of my parents. It was by Natsumi Soseki. And I loved that immediately because I thought this is what the book is about to a large extent, that you can't leave where you're from. You know, I mean, you can leave physically, but it's in you. It's part of your history. It's part of your essence. You take it with you wherever you go. And I love the idea that even the color of air was different where he was born. And when you're writing about a place like Hawaii, well, that just kind of hands you place on a platter, right? Everything about Hawaii, you know you're there as soon as you get off the plane, as soon as you step foot on the islands. You feel that you're in Hawaii because of the five senses, what you're smelling, the feel of the air. I don't know if the color of the air, but you know, I mean, even there's a certain hue, I think, that you see to the place you're born. And I think it just complemented the story when I went back. And so when it was time to find the title, I had put down the color of air thinking they're gonna not choose this. They're gonna think, oh, it's too abstract, it's too poetic. They're not gonna know it's about Hawaii. And out of the blue, my editor said, I love this title. You know, we will make it work so that they know it's a story of Hawaii. And so that's how The Color of Air became the title. And to me, I'm so happy about that. As you well know, Karen, you don't always get your way when a book comes out.
No, this is true. And now, you know, now I've gone down to a rabbit hole of all my grievances and have forgotten what I was just about to ask you. I was just going to say that I don't think it would surprise anyone who's read any of your books to hear that you love poetry. That to me, the texture of your prose and the imagistic quality of your prose and the rhythm of your prose, all it simultaneously feels very natural, like a very natural voice, but it's also a very beautiful voice. So I think it's one of the things that people love about your work is, as you said, that you care about the words. And do you find that as a reader too? Are you very conscious of the prose when you're reading books?
I would say that I tend to lean towards writers who write lyrically. You know, it is a form of inspiration when somebody writes in a way where you're inspired. And because I do come from that poetry background, I do think that I lean towards a lot of novelists who started their careers as poets. And off the top of my head, I'm thinking Louise Erdrich. I think Barbara Kingsolver came from a poetry background. You know, I'm thinking of ones, I don't know, Stegner? Did Stegner come from a, but you know, people who use language in a way that just, less is more. You know, something I always felt like I gravitated to the fact that you could write something in a small scene that said volumes. You know, so I do lean towards that, but I do think that language is so, it can be used in so many different ways, and that's the beauty of it. I also like, you know, people who tell me a lot of things that I want to know at the same time, you know. So it just depends, because you can write a lot, but still be very poetic. And so I think I gravitate towards the lyrical type of writing, but it doesn't mean it has to be in a small space. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, absolutely.
You know, I mean, you still say what you need to say, but I'm looking for certain rhythms, and I think I'm more attuned to certain rhythms. And when I find them, it's just like joy, because I tend to reread books if they've inspired me. I tend to go back and look on the shelf and say, oh, I really love this book, so I'm going to reread it because of this, because they were able to do this. They were able to write this fantastic scene that I still can't figure out how they did it. And it's that kind of thing where it's always trying to be a little better, with what you're doing yourself. And so I do return to books a lot. And they not necessarily have to be poetic, in a sense, but they just have to offer something that I learn from, and I learn to be a better writer from.
I think one of the things that makes this, in my mind, kind of a book of the moment is how focused it is on community at a time when our communities have sort of been ripped away from us in a lot of ways. There's just something very, very moving about reading about this place where people are so embedded in not only the land that they inhabit, but the people that they have lived with for most of their lives, most of them. And one of the things where I think the poetry is really powerful is the technique that you've used of the island voices. Could you talk about that a little bit? The sort of community voices that you bring in, not the main character voices, but the interludes where we have somebody else who speaks.
Well, it was a little actually fearful on my part. It was like, is this too schizophrenic? Do I have too many voices coming out here? But, I think early on, I knew that I wanted to write about community more than anything else. And I think as writers, I've been privileged to actually see something that Karen is working on now. And I think it's very prevalent of what's going on now in our daily life, even though it's historically set also. And I think that as writers, we don't choose. We don't sit there and think. And I remember when some high school students were using the Samurai's Garden, and they would send me emails, and they would say, do you sit down and think of the images before you put it down? Do you think of this metaphor, blah, blah, blah? And of course, we don't work that way. We don't think, oh, this is going to be the image. This is going to be a metaphor. This is going to be what we're writing about, because we think that in the future, whether it be 2, 3, 4, 5 years that it takes to write a novel, that we're going to project and feel this is what's going to be happening in that day and age. I think that there are big themes that we choose to write about, and sometimes they cross over, and certainly what you're writing about now does. And I think that somehow this one also did. The idea of survival and community and coming together at a time when something big is happening. Now we have the pandemic. Then they had the eruption of the volcano. But it's not like it's plotted. It's not like it's planned. We don't sit down and project what's going to happen in the future. I just think that there are certain themes that cross in a writer's life that we pick up on for some subconscious. I don't know. I would have to say subconscious. I don't know about you, Karen. You might have projected and thought, yeah, Black Lives Matter is going to happen, and I'm on this. But I didn't at all. What I thought about is community. How did this community become this community? I think that's what I was more interested in. How did the Hawaii that we visit today when we go on vacation or we go, to any of the islands, how did they become this blended community? And that was what had interested me from the get-go. And that was what I wanted to explore. And so I started to research and realize it had to do with, of course, the plantations and everything, and bringing all these different cultures to the islands in the first place. So all of this kind of ties in without tying in, without knowing what's going to happen in present day. But I wanted all of their voices because I knew they were coming from different places with the idea of community. Because if I had just settled on just doing one particular character, it would be his story. But we know that there's so many stories when it's a community that comes from immigrants, from different storylines, from different backgrounds. And I guess at one point I thought to myself, hell, I got to tell all their stories somehow. you know this feeling when you're just kind of going like, I can't just tell it from one point of view. And the book was began many times. You saw early renderings of it.
I did. There was initially a banquet, wasn't there? There was supposed to be.
That was another book.
That was
That's okay. No, what you had seen was some of the things that were pushed back that was up front. And again, that's the fascination of writing a book, because nothing is what you think it'll be when you begin the book. And I know you can talk to this, right?
I was very affected hearing another friend say something about her work. She was talking about her short stories, but she said, the story I write always rises out of the ashes of the story I thought I was going to write.
That's
that's my experience as well.
Yeah, and I think the problem was when you have a book that deals with so many characters and so many points of view and what you're trying to say and what you're trying to show the reader in terms of this is one big community and all this is happening at the same time that a volcano is exploding, and you have labor union problems and you have all these, and as writers, we know that we make conscious choices. We have to, right? As to what we're going to show and what we're going to put in the front seat and what we're going to put in the back seat, I guess, and because we both have written historically, and I probably most of mine are historical, and many of your books are historical also. It's always that feeling of spending hours and hours of researching and loving everything you're researching and just hoping that everything can go in the book, and then realizing, geez, maybe you're lucky if 20% goes in the book, and the rest of it is kind of put in the backseat.
Yeah. My third novel, I was forced to cut some scenes that I really loved, and they were right to force me. I completely agree with the decision. It was still a painful decision. And so when I went out with the book, as you're now doing, I read the pages that I had cut when I was, going around to try to talk people into buying the book. I would say, okay, well, these pages aren't actually in the book, but they were at one point, and I like them, so I'm going to read them. We've come around to a subject that I did want to talk to you about, which is that you do almost always write historical fiction, and yet I don't think of you as a historical fiction writer, and I suddenly today got puzzled over that fact, and I guess because maybe because your characters are so vivid and so much in the front seat, that the historical setting is more in the back seat in your books in some sort of way. And I wondered, just do you think of yourself as a historical novelist, and do you have theories about what historical fiction should do, shouldn't do?
Oh dear, you're asking me if no, I think it's a really good question, because I still flinch a little when I see her historical fiction novel, blah, 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 and I'm thinking, it is? I guess it is. I guess anything's not in the present day is historically, if it's back, is historical.
Tragically, now I read books that take place in the 1960s, which I remember vividly, and they're suddenly historical novels.
Yeah, I've been watching a lot of documentaries, and one was about Laurel Canyon, and I'm going, I love this music, and now it's history. Come on, the mamas and the papas and all that, that's history now. Kids that they will never know who the mamas and papas are. When I was thinking that, it always blows my mind. I think partly it's because I love going back in time to see how we got to where we are to a large extent. And that's why I keep stepping back and maybe even to see how I got here now. Asian American, or whatever it is, in the Bay Area. And so I go back and I try to find historically things that kind of brought me here, whether, you know, it does or not. But it all lends itself to being Asian American, being in the Bay Area now. But when I'm in the actual place of writing a book, I don't look at it as being historically at all. What I've usually done is researched it enough that I feel comfortable in the place. And then I begin kind of formulating the characters and who they are. And I always believe that if characters are the same through history, we feel the same, we have the same interior. In other words, nothing changes in terms of how we feel and how we act, and you know, the big themes like love and jealousy and hate and, you know, all those kind of things, they don't change through time. They remain the same in terms of characters. We feel the same, we do a lot of the same things through time. What changes is the background, you know, how we're living, whether we use, I don't know, a sword or a fork or you know, whatever. But when I begin to know a place really well, and when I begin to understand the characters that I'm writing about in that place, I don't feel that it's being historical at all. I just feel like I'm in that place. And I think, and my main goal is always to make the reader feel that they're also in that time and place, so that they understand how things are. And it is a little difficult when you're in a country that is not a place where we're used to being in America, say China back in a certain time. Then there are things that you need to bring forward in terms of historical. But I always felt comfortable because I thought if I understood the characters and how they felt, I could put them in any scene at any time. And if that carried through to the reader, they would understand the reactions of the characters. And that was the most important thing. You know, I mean, me as a reader, if I think like, oh, that character would have never done that, then that just stops the story for me. But if I realize that the character would do that then, and they would do that now, because that's the same kind of feelings that come out of the human being kind of thing, then I get it. And that's what I've always tried to transfer first into more. And that's why when I see historical, I think, oh yeah, I guess it is historically back in time. But it always feels, in the same sense, very present for me.
Yeah, maybe.
You, what do you think when you're writing historically? Do you feel like you're way back transferred in time? Well, of course, in terms of how they live, yes, but feelings.
The feelings. You know, I would try to access the characters' feelings in the same way that I would in a contemporary novel. But I do work to feel that I'm in that other place and time, that you know, that it's not easy for me to sink into the time that I'm that I'm researching. And you know, I'm always you know, sitting and thinking, oh, well, what did the chairs look like? You know, who's making the chairs, and did they rock?
Fun, though, isn't it? It's like, do they use forks and spoons? No, they would use
And you know that someone out there is going to know, and they're going to read your book, and they're going to fling it across the room.
And it has happened, I'm sure. And that's when I fall back on the fiction part. It's fiction.
You know, I think I mean, there are several characters that seem very central to this book, but certainly one of them is Daniel. And Daniel is the character who's gone and come back. And what does the creation of that dynamic bring to the book, as opposed to the people who have been there and been together as the world changes around them, but who have not left?
Well, I think you've just said it right there. You need somebody, I mean, can you imagine living on an island where change doesn't come quickly? You know, to a large extent, which I always find interesting too, because I think even in present day, places that are more secluded. Probably don't get changed as quickly as big cities, as places where you see what's coming at you right away. So in a way, he was the character that brought back some of the mainland world. On the other hand, I think that what he was really missing in his own life was the community and the small island life that he didn't have for that period of time that he was gone. And that he needed it again because he came home for a reason, and he needed that kind of nurturing. You know, so I think it was kind of interesting because I got it, and you know this, when you start a book, you don't, I mean, I don't know what's gonna actually fall on the page until it happens. And then it's really one scene to the next scene kind of thing. I don't plot ahead of time, so I didn't quite know exactly when he got off the boat in the beginning, other than the volcano erupting and that there was going to be some big secret. I didn't know that when I began.
Know what the secret was?
I don't think I knew exactly what the secret was until not far along. I figured it out, but I didn't know at the beginning of the book. But I do know that he returned for a certain reason. I do know that he would learn what was happening as time went on. And that it would be these kind of seismic tremors of this whole volcano erupting at the same time that would kind of stir his life at the same time. But you know, I always start when I think that I'm starting with a specific character, it kind of moves outwards. I don't know if this happens with you, where you start with a character you think is going to be your main character. And then what happens is all these other characters jump in and they take so much room, you know, that you didn't think they would take. And I don't know if that happens when you're starting with a particular character in mind, that what happens is all these other characters start taking over. And I'm often thinking, I really like this character. I want to spend more time with this character. And yet you have this balance because you have a main character that you started with. So what you do is what I did. You have every character come in and tell their story.
This is a bit of a tangent, but it's a weird phenomenon that I've noticed in sitcoms, that there's something like the Mary Tyler Moore Show. So she's the main character, but soon all the characters around her are actually more interesting than she is. And so they get spin-offs, and then you have Rhoda, but when Rhoda's the main character, then she's not as interesting anymore, and it's the people around her.
And why do you think that happens?
I don't know. I don't know why that happens.
But that's a good analogy.
But I did find Daniel interesting throughout, in spite of the fact that he was a central character and not the central character.
I guess, you know, you do need that thread. You need that character that comes in and riles everything up, you know, one way or another. And I think that's it. But because this particular book had characters that I think I liked so much, that were actually on the island, the Hilo aunties, the community that they had, that I think it changed. And I don't think it's a bad thing, because I think you have to have that starting point, that starting character that kind of kicks off everything, for you to kind of branch out, to find the Rhodas, to find the Ted Baxters, to find the other characters, you know, that kind of pick up the speed. And then you find that, like the sitcoms, what you're saying is most of the sitcoms work because there are a bunch of characters.
Yeah, because it's an ensemble.
Yes, the ensemble thing that makes it work, because you have, you know, your funny character over here, you have this character over there. And I think that actually does work in novels at the same time too. And because you're kind of gaining the speed as you move forward, that you don't have in the very beginning. So you need that central character to branch out to all the other ensemble characters.
It is so deeply set in this particular place, not just the people, but the natural world. And in the case of this novel, the very threatening natural world. And I felt I felt a deep longing to be in Hawaii. I probably,
So,
yeah, I mean,
well, right now, would you say?
you know, if I had to get trapped somewhere in the pandemic, yes, I wish it had been Hawaii.
That would be a nice place to be trapped.
And you and I spent many, many summers together in Hawaii when we taught at the Maui.
Very lucky. Yeah,
Writers
we did the
Workshop.
Maui Writers Conference
Yeah.
those years. And
But what's your particular attachment to Hawaii personally? Do you have a?
well, my father was born and raised in Oahu, Japanese, but born and raised in Hawaii. So actually, it was in some ways, my brother and I went as children back and forth to Hawaii to visit the relatives a lot. So, I had that always in the back of my mind, always somewhere in the upbringing and who you are and whatnot. But I was always curious about the Japanese side because I didn't have any of that. And so as you know, so many of the novels go back and forth between my cultures, between my mother, who was born in Hong Kong and was Chinese, and my father, who was born in Hawaii and raised in Hawaii, who was Japanese. But we never were raised in the Japanese culture. And that early on in my writing career was something that I was very curious about. What it meant to be Japanese and what culturally is invested in who I am. Now. And so I spent many years writing books that were set in Japan. And of course, part of the gift of being a writer is being able to kind of go back and explore cultures and explore interests and explore themes that we wouldn't normally be able to in the real world if we had a steady job that, that that didn't allow us to spend half of our time researching what it means to be Japanese or Irish or whatever, French. So I think I was very fortunate that I was able to write like The Samurai's Garden, which was a book in which I knew nothing about the Japanese culture. And my main goal with that book is try to see what it would feel like to be Japanese. What does that mean to you? And so that's when I just immersed myself in researching everything about the Japanese culture, from language to the types of fence they used in that Terumi area, which my main character would be, recuperating in, to the kind of beaches they had, to all of that, and art and nature and gardens, of course. And those are the things that stood out, and those are the things that went into the book itself.
Did those things then go into you as well?
I think so, because I think that in so many ways, there's so much about the Japanese culture that I feel closer to in terms of poetry, nature, the kind of Zen, quiet way of looking at things. And I think it's the poetry background. And I think I really found all that out when I started to write the books. Not that I don't feel Chinese at the same extent, but it's a whole different culture. What has come over in the Chinese is the family-oriented. When you go into a Chinese restaurant, you're in a Chinese restaurant. It's loud. There's food everywhere. There's like those lazy Susans are spinning. In the Japanese restaurant, it's much quieter. So there's the differences in that way. And there's a lot of similarities also. But I found in terms of the spareness of art, the poetry, the Zen way of looking at things, I felt much more Japanese, I think, in some ways. And so I've written about the two cultures back and forth, and I got to this point where we had gone to Hawaii a lot, and I always loved Hawaii. I was fortunate to be with all of you in the Maui Writers Conference for several years. And then I started to think about place. And I think place is important with a lot of the books I write. A lot of times I start with the idea of a character, but more often I think of place. And I think I did it with the Street of a Thousand Blossoms when I was thinking about sumo wrestlers. I thought, well, where did he grow up? And what was the place that he grew up in? You know, so there were certain things that I gravitated to when I begin a novel. And with Hawaii, it just lends itself to place. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. You know, I mean, in terms of everything, when going back and talking about the title, it's just the place you were born has effect on you, whether it's Indiana, you know, whether it's the Bay Area for me. But I can imagine how it might be if you're from Hawaii and then you go to the mainland, like the Midwest, Chicago, like my main character does, how different it is when you return, because all of suddenly it hits you in the face. This is what I remember, you know, the smells, the whole idea of every time a volcano erupts, it adds more landmass. You know, that fascinated me, all of this, the idea of it. It's like no other place when something happens does it add to, you know, the area of it. And so, you know, all those kind of things, when I started researching, it just kind of grew from there. What would it mean if you were gone and you thought you wanted to be away from this small community, that you wanted to know what it meant to be in the big world? You know, then what happens when something happens and you have to go back to the small world and you realize that it is your world, kind of thing. You know, those were the things I was thinking about when I began it. So I thought, well, it has to begin here. It had to begin with place in this particular book, because it was so important to everything. All of these immigrants who came to this place, you know, and how it changed them, but how they turned around and actually made it the Hawaii that it is today.
Yeah. I've just pulled up a question somebody asked, which is right in this same area. So I'll read it to you. It is, has your connection to Hawaii influenced your affinity for language and poetry? And I think, you know, I think you've partly answered that in terms of the Japanese community. But you know, the Hawaiian language itself is so bizarre in
well, I mean, again, it's you know, it's I think that's what makes Hawaii so interesting, and a culture within a culture. I mean, you know, it's part of the United States, but it has its own culture at the same time, and it's because of the splendid community that came over during the plantation years in the late 1800s, that you had this mixture of all these different, you know, Filipino, Chinese, Japanese, Puerto Rican, Portuguese, that in turn developed their own language, because you had the Hawaiians that were there. In order for everybody to understand each other, they developed the pidgin language. You know, so you have all these things that I think is fascinating because they became their own culture in a way. And that's the culture we see today, that's so different from any other parts of the United States that we've traveled to and have gone to, because they've upkept this kind of community that they've brought from back then and just grown and learned from it. But you know, the pidgin language, the blending of foods, you know, the blending of all the cultures in order of what they celebrate, how they live their lives. And I find it fascinating because they've been able to keep that, you know, and that's what's become the Hawaii that we've known today. And I think that was one of the reasons that I was so fascinated with actually writing this particular book, was because I was curious. It was like, how did this all happen? You know, and how can I make this work? So I tell this story with all that's going on, kind of through the more personal story of the characters and what they're living, you know, all the background information. And I remember making that choice. I mean, there's so many stories here. It's like, do you write about the plantations? Do you write about the natural world? Do you write about this? Or do you write about that? How do you write all of it without taking away from my main idea of writing about these particular characters and the community that had all come together? And so that was when I think I made a decision that the political aspects, the big things would come through the personal stories as apart from the other way around. You know, where the big political issues are in front, I think I decided then that I wanted kind of the personal stories to be up front, and the political actions would kind of drive it. I don't know.
Yeah, there is a lot of political background in the book, and I find that also very fascinating, the sort of the whole plantation system, and also the ways in which the different cultures could be played off against each other, as well as
Yes. Those plantation owners were not fooling around. They knew from the get-go, keep them separated.
yeah.
You know, and of course the irony is there are no more sugar plantations on the islands anymore. The last one closed in 2016 on the island of Maui.
Not know that.
What has happened is that you still have this blended community that has made up what Hawaii is today.
We have another question. How do you organize all of your research materials and notes? This is, I think, you know, in the larger picture, just sort of how do you deal with research? You do the research, and then how do you control the research?
Oh, Karen, how do you control it?
I don't.
There is no control in the beginning. It's actually kind of terrifying, because you have all this good stuff, and you have they're in files, you know, all your notes and all your research and all these things that you've read and typed up, and then you're thinking, now how am I going to put this all in a story? And there's this great moment of fear before I start anything, where I feel like it's too much. I can't handle it. I don't know how to do this. You know, and it doesn't change. I mean, every book is different. I'm sure you feel this way, you know, that where you're dealing with things that you feel at one point, at some time, or many times, where you think, I can't handle this. This is too much stuff. You know, and that's when you start making conscious choices. What will go in, what won't go in, what will be driving issues but not take over. You know, it's hard to tell, because I think I really start with just writing the storyline, the plot line, and allowing things to come in as I'm doing it. Because if I do it any other way, it becomes a little overwhelming for me. How do you approach this? Because, you know, so many of your books have taken a great deal of research.
You know, I sort of think of it in two phases. That I do a lot of research while I'm looking for the story, so that it's very, you know, free range kind of research, where I've chosen a place and a time, and I just begin to read nonfiction about the place. If it's possible, I read newspaper articles that were contemporaneous to the time I'm going to be looking at. And I'm just, at that point, I'm really looking for things that will spark story ideas. And then as the story gets more solid in my head, then I move to sort of phase two, where I know I need something particular. I need to find out, you know, where this person was on this date. And then it's very targeted research. But yeah, there's always, I mean, there are always so many stories you could choose to tell out of the research that.
And you know, and the hard part is this: sometimes you're researching, and you find something that has nothing at all to do with the book you're writing or the time, but it's such a
so irresistible, yeah.
that you feel this could be a whole nother book, and maybe I should be writing this book and not that book. You know, so there's like all this juggling that you're doing, because research just opens the door to so many things. But I agree with you that you have to make those choices. You know, that you have to pick and choose to a large extent what you want to focus on. I think I was lucky, or that I kind of, in my research of the islands, and especially the Big Island, knowing that they had so many volcanic eruptions, that I had kind of looked into it and thought, you know, time-wise, this is what I would like to write about this time, from 1930 forward. And so I started kind of closing some doors, you know, that I didn't worry about beyond 1930. I didn't worry about this. And if I could find something like a volcano eruption in the 1930s, oh, look, it took over 6 weeks and it's heading towards Hilo. Well, plot line, right? There are certain things where you're thinking right away, well, that would work. That would work with, you know, giving me time periods that I could deal with, that made it less frightening to think that there's too much history, there's too much this. So what it is then, you're
built-in suspense and a built-in momentum.
Yeah, and then built-in history that would fit into the storylines of the characters and the plot line itself, that you could pick and choose from rather than dealing with this whole entire world that feels too big, that you can't deal with. So, you know, and those little gifts are really helpful when that happens. You know, and I know that when you begin a book, you're not thinking in those terms, but as you're researching, I think a lot of things are found out, you know, as you go along. And it has been for me, you know, I mean, that certainly was one of the things. When I started going into the natural world, when I started thinking about the environment of Hawaii, that's when I started reading about things that had happened in terms of natural events. The typhoons, the tsunamis, the volcano eruptions, the earthquakes. And then that began to help me with how the plot was going to form.
I think, you know, it's one of the things about Hawaii, I'm sure about many, many other places as well, but that the natural world really impinges on your lives in profound and expected and unexpected ways, that you're always, to a certain extent, at the mercy of the natural world there.
Well, in a way, it makes it easier. In a way, it makes it harder, right? Because you got to fit your plot line into that. But it does give you something to work with. You know, I think that makes it. It has for me made it easier, because I think when natural events happen, I kind of put this plot line around it, so it made the timing work and focused the storyline a lot, that I think would be a tiny bit harder if you didn't have that. And I think that in terms of what historical fiction is, you know, I mean, the things that happened historically was, you know, Patton was in charge with bombing the volcano at that time. And I didn't know all that.
Yeah, I did not know that either.
Yeah.
Read this book, you will find out some things you did not know.
Yeah, because the writer didn't know until she started writing.
There's another question here. Over the years, as I've read each of your books, I have found that so many of your characters remain with me. My version of heaven would be to live in Matsu's garden. Can you discuss how you create your characters so that they become so rich and vivid?
Oh dear. A lot of glasses of wine. You know, I mean, I've never written a question that I've always gotten is, do you know these people? You know, are they taken from real characters and are they put into your books? And I've always tried to stay away from that. I've never used somebody I know in real life in a book, because it always
Actually, that was the next question that came up. Are any of the characters in this book based on family members?
But it's not to say that there aren't parts of people I know that go into characters that I write about. You know, you're taking things from everywhere. You know, a motion that somebody does with their hands. Somebody who's thinking that always, you know, grabs their hair when they're doing. You know, there are things that I do take from real life, but other things I take partially from people. You know, the sense of humor, the way they laugh, how they think of things, how I think of things. You know, I mean, it's kind of conglomerate of many people in my life, I think, that go into the characters. People I would want to know, I guess, Matsu is that perfect man. And maybe that was my idea of the perfect man who would carry stones up a mountain to build you a garden because he loved you that much. You know, so it's all of it. And it's also, as you're writing, characters develop. You know, you can't know who the character is going to be until you get to that point. In this particular book, The Color of Air, I knew that the Hilo aunties were made up of so many of the women that I've known, the Karens, the you know, people who have my back, people who are in my life, people that I can turn to when I need them. And I wanted them all to be these four women in a way that you knew that if, you know, that they would always take care of you. And I think that was something I thought about when I was writing this particular book about these aunties. And because culturally, aunties in the Asian culture, they don't have to be bloodline. They're aunties because of age, they're aunties because they're friends of your mothers, they're aunties. But, you know, we're raised by these aunties. You know, in whatever culture we are, there are those women that raise you in one way or another. And I think that's what I was thinking about when I was writing them, that I wanted to kind of, you know, say, these are the women in my lives that have made me who I am. Who continue to support me, who continue, you know, to hold me up. When you're writing a book and you want to just give it up, they say, keep going. You know, and I think that we all have these Hilo aunties, and that's what I was thinking about. So they are parts of so many different people. I think all the characters have been that, rather than just one specific character in itself, in herself, itself.
So do you get to know them as you write them?
Yes. Is that the way it is for you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes then you have to go back because realize that the character you started with is no longer the character that you have in your head.
Yeah. But, I think that the
yeah.
writing process is one step forward, 3 steps back. You know, because you don't know who the person is. And sometimes you don't know the story until you're half to 3/4 of the way through. Then it's like a light bulb goes on and you go, oh, and then you go back and you rewrite and you move forward again. And I think it's always that kind of process. And I remember being in school and your teacher would always say, you have to rewrite this. And the first thing you're thinking is, I'm not rewriting that, or I don't want to rewrite that. And now I feel that's all I do.
There's another question here. Do you begin with place and character first and then discover the story and plot along the way? I think you've sort of answered some of it.
I think that's probably pretty much it. You know, I think of early on, it would even be a first line. I'd be driving along or filling the car with gas, and this line would come to me, and I would think that's the first line. And then the next line would come, and, you know, and then things would start to develop as I went by. Kept going forward, but you know, now it's a larger space in the sense that I think of where is this going to take place, or where is this? Who is the character in which this place is going to surround? Something like that, you know. And as I think about it, it doesn't often fall into place like we want it to. You know that. You know, we have these grandiose ideas, and then you write it, and you go, "Oh, this is terrible." Yeah. You know.
That's why you rewrite.
That's why you rewrite, and you hope.
At what point do you expect to know the ending? Yeah, you know, you may not have all the pieces in place, but do you kind of know where you're headed eventually, or do you not know that either?
Most of the time, no, I don't know. I know we have friends that know exactly where they're going to. I've never been able to do that because I don't know the story until the story kind of unfolds. I would say it's not till at least 3/4 that I know that I'm getting to a specific end, that it's gonna kind of come full circle here. And sometimes not until I get very close. So I don't know ahead of time. I wish I did in some ways, then I could work towards it.
It does seem like that would be efficient, but
But life is not efficient.
no, and
Books are not efficient.
efficiency is no fun.
I think the closest I got to knowing kind of a full circle was Samurai's Garden, because I knew it was going to be 1 year. And I knew that I was going to divide it into 4 seasons, you know. So I knew that, you know, the last season was going to be the end. I just had to get them there. You know, so I did have that idea that it was going to be 1 year, 4 seasons. If I got to whatever that ended in fall or whatever, that it would end there. But I didn't know what the ending would be.
But didn't you have a similar experience with this book where you had the 6 weeks of the...
Yeah, I didn't know that at the end, the volcano would, can I not say it?
No, no.
For those of you who haven't read this, I didn't know that, yeah, the 6 weeks that it would be erupting would be the 6 weeks of plot line that it would run through. But I didn't know exactly how it was going to end. Even so, you know, like what would that last line be? What would the last scene be? But it in itself worked kind of full circle in this particular book, kind of like Samurai in that way. I think it's been harder with other books where I didn't have that ending, which is the 1 year, the 4 seasons, or the 6 weeks of time because the volcanoes, whatever happened.
Does what it does.
That's what it does.
We're at the end of the questions. I was just going to say again that I just love this book. I think it is so beautiful, and I think in many ways, my experience as a reader is that things that I don't actually want in my real life, I really, really want on the page. Like, I don't actually want to have adventures. They sound frightening and possibly filthy, and you know, food is not good, but I like them in books. And in the same way, I just took such comfort from this wonderful community that you created. And, you know, I just loved every minute being in their company. Do I really want to be in a community where people are watching me, even in that loving sort of way? Maybe not. Maybe in my real life.
Obviously, Karen, you're not Asian. Because as far as we go, we got it with us.
Every day. I learned something from this woman.
But thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being during the writing of it. Thank you for always encouraging.
Oh, it was nothing but pleasure. And
Sam, thank you again for allowing us to return.
Indeed, I think this was worth the wait. Absolutely, I imagine a lot of you agree. Thank you to both of you for joining us tonight and for having this wonderful conversation. I feel like we're just kind of sitting in on like a regular conversation that the two of you would have, and so thank you for allowing us to join.
We would be drinking more.
We would be drinking more. That is true.
Fair enough.
Conversation would have devolved, and
we can commence that now, I think. Thank you so much to everyone joining us tonight from wherever you are, whether in Seattle or in regions further flung. Again, the new book from Gail Tsukiyama is The Color of Air. There's a link in the chat. You can order that book from Third Place Books. We'll ship this book anywhere in the country for you, or you can pick it up at one of our 3 neighborhood locations, and you could do the same with Karen Joy Fowler's books. And I put a link in the chat to We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, but you can also find both of these authors' other wonderful list of titles on our website, and many more books besides. So thank you so much. Your book purchase keeps us going, keeps authors going, and keeps this whole thing going. So we really appreciate it. From wherever you're joining us tonight, we hope that you have a wonderful evening. Be safe, read good books, do good work, and take care of one another. Thank you so much, Gail Tsukiyama, Karen Joy Fowler. It's a pleasure to have you tonight, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.
thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Good night, everybody.